Montana Territory, late September, 1879, the wind carried more than cold that morning. It carried the sound of a woman's cry and the crunch of boots that did not belong. Tessa Albright stood alone outside the small log cabin nestled at the edge of the Bitterroot Mountains, her shawl pulled tight over her shoulders. Frost clung to the tips of the grass, and her fingers were red from the morning's work. Inside, her twin girls, Viola and Vina, both just 5, were still asleep under a patched quilt she had sewn herself. Her husband had left 3 weeks ago. "Just heading to Bannack for supplies," he had said, swinging up on his gelding with a rifle over his shoulder. "Be back in a few days." But the saddle remained empty, the trail cold. She had waited, she had hoped, but the food was nearly gone and the mule had gone lame 2 days back. There were no neighbors for 10 miles. And she was tired in her bones, tired where prayers no longer reached. She was hauling water from the creek when she heard hooves. Her heart twisted, but it was not her husband. A stranger rode up slow, tall in the saddle, hat pulled low. His coat was worn, dust clinging to every seam. He stopped 20 paces away, dismounted with a grace that spoke of long miles and harder years, and tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, voice low and even, "your chimney's not smoking. That concern you?" Tessa set down her bucket, eyeing the man. "We're fine," he nodded once. "I do not doubt that. But I saw your tracks yesterday, followed them through the ridge. Figured whoever lived out here might need help." She narrowed her eyes. "And you just help strangers," the man shrugged. "Sometimes." She stared at him for a long beat. He did not shift under her gaze. "I have children," she said finally. "I do not let just anyone near them." "I respect that," the man said. "Name's Xander Vexley. I am only passing through, but I do not walk away from a woman with little ones and an empty chimney." Tessa swallowed. Her pride clawed at her throat, but behind her the girls stirred. She looked at the sky, then back at him. "Firewood's low," she admitted, "and the mule's lame." "I can chop wood and take a look at the animal," he said. "You do not owe me anything." She gave a slow nod and stepped aside. "All right, come on then." He tied his horse near the barn and rolled up his sleeves before she even turned back toward the house. By mid-morning, he had split half a cord of wood and replaced the mule's cracked shoe with leather and iron from her husband's old kit. He did not talk much, but he worked steady, his presence quiet but solid. Tessa watched him from the porch, Viola clinging to her skirts and Vina peeking through the window. "Is he scary?" Viola whispered. "No," Tessa said softly. "I do not think he is." She made stew with the last of the carrots and beans. By dusk, the fire crackled again, and the girls had color back in their cheeks. When the wind howled against the walls, Tessa glanced toward the door and found Xander still out there, watching the tree line with his rifle across his knees. "Come in," she told him. "You are half frozen," he hesitated. "You sure?" She opened the door wider. "I am not going to let a man freeze after fixing my mule." Inside, the firelight softened the hard lines of his face. He looked older under the light, not in years, but in weight. Like he had seen more than most and carried every bit of it. Viola climbed into his lap without asking, and Vina offered him half a biscuit. He did not flinch. He smiled, small but real. "Thank you kindly," he said, his voice warming. Tessa watched him, something inside her shifting. She realized she had not seen kindness in a man's eyes for a long time. Not since before her husband's temper had started showing through the cracks. That night, she laid in bed, awake longer than she wanted to be. The room was quiet, save for the soft breathing of her girls. She thought about the way Xander had moved through her space, like he belonged not with arrogance, but with care. Like he saw things that needed doing and did them. She did not know what brought him here, or what kind of future he was running from, but she knew what it felt like to be left behind. And she knew what it felt like to be seen even for just a moment. The next morning, she found him at the creek, sleeves rolled up, shaving with a hunting knife. He looked over his shoulder when he heard her boots on the pebbles. "I am headed east," he said, voice steady. "But I can stay a day or two more, help you stock up before the freeze," she nodded. "I would appreciate that." He looked at her then, really looked. "You holding together," she met his gaze. "I am trying to." He gave a slow nod. "Then let me help." That afternoon, he took the girls with him to check the traps her husband had left behind. She watched from the window as Vina clung to Xander's hand and Viola chattered, pointing at a squirrel in the trees. He carried them both back when their little legs got tired. That night, when the girls were asleep, she handed him a mug of coffee by the fire. "You are not like most men," she said. He glanced at her. "That a good thing? It is." He looked down, then up again. "I was not planning to stay long, I know. But I do not like the thought of you out here alone. We have done all right. I can see that. You are strong, but strong does not mean you should have to do everything alone." She sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his arm. "You do not know me," she said quietly. "I know enough. I know you keep going when most would break. I know your daughters trust you more than anything. And I know you look out that window every night, hoping a man who left you will come back." She looked at the fire, her voice rough. "He is not coming back." "No," he said softly. "He is not." She turned toward him, her eyes shining, not with tears but with the weight of truth settling in. Xander reached out, slow and steady, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. He did not lean in, did not press. He just looked at her like she mattered. Tessa leaned toward him just a little. "I do not know what tomorrow holds," she said. "Me neither," he answered. "But tonight," she whispered, "you are here." He nodded. "I am." And for the first time in weeks, she felt the tightness in her chest loosen. She let her hand rest on his. Neither of them moved away. By the third morning, frost clung longer to the ground, and the creek ran slower beneath a skin of ice. Tessa rose before dawn, moving quiet so the girls could sleep. She stirred embers into flame and set cornmeal cakes to cook over the cast iron. The scent of browned butter filled the small cabin as pale light crept down the ridgeline. Xander had taken to sleeping in the barn loft, though she'd offered him the bench by the hearth. He hadn't accepted, not out of distance, but something else, something like respect she hadn't known a man could carry so plainly. When he came in, his coat was damp at the shoulders, boots caked in mud from checking the snares. He left the gear by the door and nodded once before washing his hands at the basin. "I found sign of elk down the slope," he said, drying his fingers on a frayed cloth. "Tracks are fresh. If I go after them now, we'll have meat before dusk." Tessa set a plate in front of him. "You don't owe us that." "I know." He took a bite, chewing slow, "but I want to." She watched him eat for a moment, her arms folded across her apron. "You always move like that's enough, just deciding to do something and then doing it." Xander looked up, thoughtful. "Spent too long in places where talk was cheap. Learned young that intention's no good if you don't follow through." She sat down across from him. "You were raised out west, Arizona territory. My mother was Mescalero Apache. My father worked freight lines between Tucson and El Paso. He died when I was 12. After that, she took me back to her people." Tessa didn't speak right away. "Was she kind?" He nodded slowly. "She had eyes like flint, but she never raised a hand to me. Taught me how to track, how to read the land. Said the desert teaches you to look past what's easy." A silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. "I think I'd have liked her," Tessa said. "I think she'd have liked you too." The girls came stumbling out of the bedroom, hair tangled, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Vina climbed into Xander's lap without hesitation, her tiny hands clinging to the edge of his shirt. He glanced down at her. "You dreaming again, little one?" She nodded solemnly. "You were riding a bear." He raised an eyebrow. "Was I winning?" "You were sharing," she whispered. He chuckled, low and warm. "Sounds right." After breakfast, he saddled his horse and slung his rifle across his back. He paused at the door, glancing toward Tessa. "Won't be gone long." She stepped out onto the porch with him, the cold air cutting through her sleeves. "Be careful," he gave her a steady look. "Always." As he disappeared into the tree line, the quiet pressed back in. Tessa gathered the girls and set them to shelling beans while she swept the hearth. The day passed in small chores and long pauses, moments where she caught herself glancing toward the woods as if she'd hear his horse before she saw it. The sun was just beginning to dip when hoofbeats finally returned. Xander rode in slow, a young elk draped across his saddle. He dismounted with a grunt, and Tessa moved to help him without a word. They worked side by side to clean and hang the meat, their hands steady, their rhythm practiced though it had never been shared before. Afterward, they sat behind the cabin, the slope falling away below them, stars beginning to show in the blue above. I didn't ask before, she said, her voice quiet, but why were you heading east? Xander didn't answer right away. He leaned back on his hands, eyes on the horizon. I buried someone in Helena, a man who called me brother though we weren't blood. We ran cattle together for 8 years. He took a bullet in the ribs during a land fight outside Bozeman. I stayed with him till the end. Tessa turned her face toward him. I'm sorry, he nodded once. After he passed, I didn't know where to go. Figured east might feel like forward. For a long moment, they sat in stillness, the only sound the rustle of pine above. I know what it is to feel unmoored, she said. To wake up and not know if you should keep going or just stop. His gaze found hers. But you keep going, so do you. He reached out then, not fast, but without question, fingers brushing hers where they rested on her skirt. She didn't pull away. I don't know what's next, she said. Neither do I, he replied, but I know where I am. She turned her palm to meet his. He held it like something precious, not like a man reaching for comfort, but like he'd found something he hadn't known he needed. Behind them, the cabin windows glowed soft with lamplight. Inside, the girls' laughter drifted through the walls. Tessa looked at the land stretching out before them, the mountains rising dark against the stars. You could stay, she said quietly. Xander didn't speak, but the way his thumb moved over her knuckles said everything. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he let out a breath that sounded like home. By the end of the week, the first snow came a light dusting that softened the world and quieted the woods. Tessa watched it fall from the porch, her shawl wrapped tighter than usual, the scent of elk stew lifting from the hearth behind her. Inside, the girls were drawing in the ashes on the stone floor with sticks, their murmurs low and content. Xander had spent the morning reinforcing the barn roof, checking the pitch and sealing gaps with packed moss and tar scraped from the pine stumps past the ridge. He moved like a man who knew what winter asked of a place like this, and he worked without needing to be told. Tessa stepped down off the porch and crossed the yard, boots crunching over the frozen earth. She didn't speak until he looked up from the beam he was setting. You planning to keep your bed in the loft all winter? She asked. His brow lifted slightly, but he didn't smile. Depends if I'm still here. She folded her arms. I'd rather not go into the season wondering if you'll be gone by first thaw. Xander leaned back against the post, wiping his palms on his trousers. You want me to stay? I wouldn't be asking if I didn't. He studied her, the silence between them stretching. I've never wintered in Montana before. I don't know what I'd be bringing with me. You've already brought more than you realize. He stepped forward, slow, his boots leaving deep prints in the snow. I ain't a man who's ever called one place home, not since I was a boy. I'm not asking you to promise forever, she said. Just askin' if you'll see what it feels like to stop running. Xander looked past her for a moment toward the cabin, where Vina's face was pressed to the window, her hands waving with excitement. Viola appeared beside her, giggling, their breath fogging the glass. He exhaled through his nose, then met Tessa's eyes. I've never had anyone wait on me to come back. Well, she said, stepping closer, you do now. That night he stayed after the girls went to sleep. They sat at the table, the oil lamp between them, the fire low but steady. She was stitching a tear in one of Viola's sleeves. He was sanding the stock of a rifle he'd found rusted behind the barn, the careful rhythm of it soothing in its own way. Did you ever think about having children? She asked without looking up. He paused, brush mid-stroke. Didn't think it was in the cards, not the way I've lived. He set the brush down, but I've thought about what it would have felt like to be needed like that. They've taken to you, she said. I didn't expect that. I didn't either, he admitted, but they see straight through. Children don't carry doubt the way grown folks do, Tessa nodded. They haven't asked once about him, not since you came. Xander didn't have to ask who she meant. She finished the last stitch and bit the thread clean. I used to think I had to make sense of it, she said, why he left. What I did wrong. But I've learned there's peace in just letting things be broken. He reached across the table, fingers brushing her wrist. Nothing about you feels broken to me. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but unflinching. I've had to patch myself together more times than I can count. I can see that. But I also see a woman who still stands straight, who taught 2 little girls how to laugh when there wasn't much reason to. She leaned into his hand, letting it rest against her cheek. He didn't move it. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she whispered. "You're not," he said. Later, when the coals were low and the wind moaned through the trees, he took the bench by the fire. She brought him a second quilt and laid it over his legs without a word. He caught her wrist before she turned. "You don't have to ask again," he said. "I'll stay." She didn't reply, but when she returned to her bed, she left the door to her room open. Morning came blue and brittle, and Xander's horse stood saddled, not to leave, but to haul wood from the far grove. He lifted each log with care, placing them in the sled he'd built from scrap boards and rusted nails. Tessa stood on the porch, the girls beside her, wrapped in matching shawls she'd sewn last winter. They didn't ask questions. They just watched him work, their eyes full of the kind of trust that can't be taught. When he returned with the load, Wiener ran to him, her mittened hands reaching for his. He lifted her easily, settling her against his hip. "You reckon the snow will stay this time?" she asked. He glanced up at the sky, then down at her. "Looks like it's planning to." Tessa met his eyes across the yard, the morning wind stirring her hair. "So am I," he said. Only to her, she didn't answer with words, she didn't have to. The snow deepened in the weeks that followed, burying the game trail and softening the world into quiet. The cabin walls creaked under the weight of wind and cold, but inside, there was warmth, a steady fire, full bellies, and the hum of something new, something not quite spoken, but present in every shared glance and gesture. Xander built a sled from cedar and ash, fitted with iron runners he'd shaped by hand. He hauled water, mended the girls' boots with leather scraps, and found a way to patch the cabin door so it no longer let in the night air. Tessa had never asked him to do any of it. He just saw what needed doing and did it. One morning, after a heavy snow, he came in from the barn with his coat dusted white and a curious look on his face. "There's fox tracks circling the smokehouse," he said, unwrapping his scarf. Tessa folded a quilt on the rocker. "We can set a snare." He knelt by the stove, rubbing his hands near the heat. "Might be more than one. I'd like to stay out there tonight, keep watch." Tessa studied him a moment. "You think they'll come close?" "I think they already have." She nodded, then said nothing. But when she brought him a wool blanket and a tin of dried apples to take with him, her hand lingered on his arm. That night, after the girls were asleep, she carried a candle to the window and saw him sitting near the smokehouse, rifle laid across his knees, still as the trees behind him. She didn't call out, just watched until the flame burned low. By morning, 2 foxes lay stretched in the snow, their red coats stark against the white. Xander skinned them clean, salted the pelts, and buried the offal deep. When he came in to wash, he paused at the door. "They won't bother your stores anymore." Tessa poured warm water into the basin. "You didn't have to stay out all night." "I know," he said, rolling up his sleeves, "but I didn't mind." Later, while the girls napped, she found him on the porch, sharpening a blade with slow, even strokes. She sat beside him, close enough their shoulders touched. "You ever think about staying through spring?" she asked, eyes on the distant ridge, his hands stilled. "I've thought about it more than I expected to." She looked at him then, not asking, just waiting. He set the blade down. "When I was younger, I used to think if I stayed anywhere too long, I'd end up buried there. So I kept moving. Figured distance would keep the worst parts of me from setting in. And now I wonder if the worst parts were never about where I was." Tessa leaned back, watching breath curl from her lips. "I don't need fixing, Xander. I never thought you did. But I want something more than surviving. I want steadiness, something my girls can grow into without fear." He nodded once, then looked toward the barn. "I've been carving something for them. Was going to wait till it was done. But you don't have to wait," she said. He stood, disappeared into the barn, and returned carrying a small wooden cradle. Not large, not elaborate, but smooth and sturdy, with 2 hand-carved birds perched at the arch. "I used some of the pine from the old fence," he said. "Didn't want it to go to waste." Tessa traced her fingers along the edge. "You made this for them?" "I made it because I wanted them to know they're worth building for." She stepped closer, resting her head against his chest. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" He wrapped his arms around her, his voice low in her hair. "Not unless you send me. I'd be a fool to do that." He held her there, steady and quiet, until the porch boards creaked and Viola's voice called out from the doorway, half sleepy, half hopeful. "Mama, are we safe?" Tessa turned in Xander's arms, lifting her voice just enough. "We are, sweetheart. We're safe now." When spring came, it came slow, first in the drip of snowmelt from the roof, then in the soft unfurling of green at the creek's edge. The cradle stayed by the hearth, now filled with dolls and pine cones and the soft laughter of two little girls who no longer looked toward the road with questions. And Xander stayed too. He didn't talk about leaving. He built a new fence instead, reinforced the root cellar. And when Tessa placed her hand over his one evening, as the girls ran through the yard chasing each other in the dusk, he turned toward her without hesitation. "I never knew what it meant to belong somewhere," he said. "You do now," she answered. He bent his head, kissed her not like a man passing through, but like a man who'd found his place. In the hush that followed, as the stars came out and the mountains held the last light of day, there was no more road to outrun, no more silence to fill. Just a woman and a man and two daughters, and a future built not from what had been lost, but from what they chose to keep. By late April, the thaw had crept all the way up the slope, leaving patches of black earth and last year's grass exposed. The sound of running water returned to the creek, louder now, and birds nested beneath the eaves. Tessa stood barefoot near the open cabin door, sunlight brushing her arms as she worked a comb through Viola's hair. The girl sat still on a low stool, her eyes half-lidded, humming off-key. Inside, Vina was crouched near the hearth, arranging flat stones in a precise circle. She'd taken to building her own small fires out of twigs and dry moss, mimicking the grown-ups with careful seriousness. Xander had shown her how to lay kindling just once, and she hadn't forgotten a step since. He was out back, digging post holes for the new garden fence. The soil had softened enough to take a spade, and he worked with steady rhythm, sleeves pushed high, boots sunk deep. Tessa watched him through the window, her fingers still in her daughter's hair. The sight of him out there, shaping the land alongside her, was something she still didn't quite know how to name, but it filled her with a kind of quiet certainty. That evening, when the girls had gone to bed, she stepped out to the porch with 2 tin cups of boiled sassafras. He was already there, arms resting on his knees, watching moths flicker near the lamp. She handed him a cup and sat beside him, letting their knees touch without needing to explain it. "I got a letter from the Draper family," she said. "They're moving to Missoula by summer, and they asked if I'd consider taking in their milk cow." Xander took a sip before answering. "Would we have enough hay to keep her through next winter?" "We would if I start cutting in July and cover the south field," he nodded. "Then we should take her." Tessa tilted her head toward him. "You said we." "I meant it." They sat in silence for a beat, listening to the wind shift in the trees. "You know," she said, "a preacher still comes out this way every 3rd Sunday. He stops at the Anders place, then circles back past the mill road." He turned to her. "You thinking about church? I'm thinking about making this official." Xander didn't answer right away. He finished his drink, set the cup down, then reached for her hand. His voice was even, but there was something in it that made her chest tighten. "I've been waiting to ask you, just didn't want you to feel pushed. I know what it costs to trust again." She squeezed his hand. "It doesn't feel like a cost anymore." He leaned in and kissed her, slow and sure, like a man not making a promise but keeping one. She leaned into him, the taste of sassafras on both their lips, the porch still warm from the day's sun. That Sunday, the preacher came just as expected, a narrow-shouldered man with a leather-bound Bible and a wagon full of hymnals. They stood beneath the cottonwood tree behind the cabin, the bark still damp from spring rain. Tessa wore her mother's shawl, the one with the faded rose stitching, and Xander had scrubbed his hands raw that morning just to feel clean enough. Viola and Vina scattered wildflower petals in the grass, giggling behind their palms. The vows were short, spoken low, with the sound of the creek running behind them. When it was done, he didn't kiss her out of obligation. He kissed her because she was his now, and he was hers, and there was no wind strong enough to carry either of them away. That summer, they planted together. Rows of beans, squash, and potatoes, each furrow laid down by both their hands. The fence held through the storms, and the cow settled in behind the barn, gentle and yielding. The girls slept sound through thunder, knowing someone would be there in the morning. Xander built a cradle for the bedroom, this one not for play. Tessa didn't tell the girls right away. She waited until the leaves began to fall and her skirts grew tighter. When she finally told them, Viola clapped so hard her palms turned red, and Vina whispered something into her stomach like it was already listening. He stayed with her through the winter again, and the next spring he held their son in his arms before she even had the strength to speak. The boy had eyes like hers and a quiet mouth like his father's. They named him Illy. Years passed, and the cabin walls were carved with new notches, one for every birthday, every harvest, every snowfall survived. Xander never spoke of leaving again. He taught the girls how to track deer and how to read the stars. Tessa taught them how to sew a hem steady and how to choose kindness even when it was hard. They never locked the door. They never needed to. And on warm evenings, when the sun dipped behind the ridge and the land turned gold, they sat on the porch, side by side, watching their children run barefoot through the field. Her hand always found his. His thumb always brushed the back of hers, not because they were trying to hold on, but because they already had.